Hi, this is Misha, and in this video, thought I would talk about some of the shuttle pods and shuttlecraft used by the Federation, looking of course at the Eagle Moss shuttles from their sets. There are currently 4 sets with 16 shuttles in total. I have 13 of them laid out here. I have picked out 3 that aren't really shuttles per se or used on board starships. I'll put those in a different video. This will probably be a relatively long one, but it didn't seem worth it to break these up into individual videos because there'd be a lot of them, and I didn't really want to do them via shuttle packs because there's no real consistency as far as eras and generations. I have more or less arranged them by date. Yes, I have included the Kelvin ones because I think they more or less fit in, and I'll explain as we go along. So we go from the Enterprise Shuttlepod all the way to the heavy cargo transport Argo from Nemesis. And it will only be a matter of a few seconds before I knock one or more of these off because they're just sitting on little pedestals. So let's get to going. First up, chronologically, the earliest Starfleet shuttle we see is the Shuttlepod from Enterprise. This is what I was saying about, they're just little pedestals. They don't really contour to the shuttles specifically. It's just a generic pedestal with the name on the bottom, so they just sit on it. Anyway, this is the Shuttlepod from Enterprise. This was very important to the ship because at that time transporters were very new. Shuttlepods were the standard for transport. 2 were on board the NX-01. These can carry a total of 6 with a pilot and a co-pilot and a crew of 4 plus cargo. These are definitively sub-warp. In fact, they can go about a quarter impulse speed. They do have armament, but they're just plasma cannon, so the pretty lightweight armament for the day. No shields, of course. They have hatches and a docking hatch. These wings are used for atmospheric flight, and they kind of pop out. They can be retracted for storage. The design is pretty neat because it's not overly complicated. It still has that boxy Star Trek, Starfleet shuttle design we know and love, but it also is more angular, more like a current 21st century airplane or spaceship or lifting body. Kind of has a lifting body thing if you took the wings off. Just as a reminder, folks, I guess I'm going to have to start putting these in because but I am blind, so doing my best to get these things on camera. Apologies when I don't. But this seemed like it was the standard shuttlecraft for not just the NX-01 but other Starfleet ships, as far as also installations, and it was capable of atmospheric flight, of course. Pretty much all of these are. The Eagle Moss model itself is actually quite nice. It's got some weight to it. Bottom is polymer, top bit is metal. It's a good size. I know this one was pretty anticipated. One thing I liked about how Enterprise handled shuttles, unlike Voyager, they actually treated the shuttle pods like they were not disposable, so they had consistency on keeping them on board. Next up, we're going to move to the JJ verse. Sort of. This is the medical shuttle from the Kelvin from the Star Trek film. Although technically this would still be prime timeline, because we saw this in 2233 when Nero first appeared, so this would have been standard timeline, so this counts. So chronologically speaking, this is the next shuttlecraft we see after the Shuttlepod. I couldn't really find an exact length or crew. Probably about the same as the Enterprise there. Let's say 8 meters. Why not? Throwing that out there. This is the medical, like I said, variant. The standard shuttlecraft variant was the same, except the markings. They didn't have the red, of course. And they didn't have medical equipment. It's pretty much the standard shuttle. Sub-warp. So just an impulse shuttle. I'm sure the medical was not armed. The model, as you see, is a little smaller. This was from the most recent shuttle pack. And there is a flaw right here. I don't know if I can really show you, but I'll do my best. That little hole in the nacelle there. Pylon. It's not on this side. Actually, I had this on pre-order, and so when this came in, I thought it didn't seem right, but I wasn't sure, not being able to see pictures online, so I had to wait for other reviews to come out to know that, yes, that in fact was an error. And I wasn't actually sure if that was right or that was right, which side was supposed to be right on this, although I suspected the port side here was correct. To Elon Musk's credit, they offered to replace, well not replace, but refund, return and refund if people weren't happy. I don't like it enough. If they reissue a replacement, I did call them and see if they end up making a revised version. I would be interested in getting it, but I don't really want to return it. It's a little smaller than the Shuttlepod, but technically in universe. So this would have been an early 23rd century shuttlecraft, and this is the medical variant. Moving on, we have another one from the JJ verse here. This is the transport shuttle, or military shuttle. This seems kind of a do anything, do everything, multi-role shuttle in the 2250s. It's got these little wings. It's got small little impulse drives on the top. It's actually a big shuttle, but the model's relatively small. It's about 12 meters long in universe. And it can be configured to transport people, cargo, freight, whatever. We see it used on Earth by the Academy. We see it used by the Enterprise. We see it used by outposts. It's just kind of a do everything. It's got the typical boxy shape. It's got kind of the wings like the pod. And while this is technically after the timeline change, I actually think it fits in quite good to a cargo shuttle. And when we get to the Argo in a while, you'll see that there's actually kind of a similarity there. So that's why I chose to put it in the list here. Plus, this is one of the older shuttles. So, I don't know. The whole time change, incursion, sure, it would have changed things, but down to different shuttles, I don't know about that. Moving on, we have another shuttle from the JJ verse, shuttlecraft here. It's a little bigger model, very reminiscent of the Galileo shuttle, boxy shape. I've heard this referred to as the Moore type, M-O-O-R-E. The Eagle Moss calls it the the passenger shuttle. So similar to a transport, yeah. It's kind of an homage to the original. It's curious if this is warp capable or not, because it has small impulse drives at the top, and then it has these nacelles. Now previously, when we've seen nacelles like this, they've still been just impulse nacelles. And for 2258, when we first see this, we would think it would be still sub-warp, but maybe this was one of their first long-range warp shuttles. Don't know. Not really much to say about it, aside from I like the fact that it's an homage to the original. It's probably my favorite shuttle out of the JJ ones. I put this next to it. This is the original Class F shuttle from the original series, TOS. This is the first shuttle we ever see in Star Trek. It's just under 7 meters long. Pretty boxy. But it's said to be maneuverable. We know it can at least hold 7 people, maybe more, a little more, maybe 8. It is capable of landing on a planet. It's actually got quite a pronounced landing gear on the bottom. Is it warp or not is a big question. It seems to be, or at least capable of short warp, because we see some of these going at warp or chasing the Enterprise or traveling in deep space. It just would not seem terribly logical for it to be sublight only. Maybe it has limited warp, warp 2 or less, I don't know. It's just hard to really fit it in. Plus, I don't think some people realize how slow sublight is in space. If this were a sublight vessel, and it were dropped off at the edge of a solar system, going to one of the inner planets, Class M, like Earth, it would take an immensely long period of time to get from the outer edge of a solar system to a planet, not to mention back, even at near full impulse. So why would they do that? It just doesn't make sense. The only time a subwarp shuttle makes sense is if you're literally just shuttling things from a planet to orbit, maybe to a moon. But otherwise, you really need warp, even if it's just warp 1 or warp 2. Obviously, I knew what this one looked like. It's the classic shuttle. But it was part of the collection, and it's just kind of a one you have to have. It's not my favorite, but I don't hate it. It's nostalgic, if nothing else. At least 4 of these were on board the Enterprise, and we know that they were also used by other starships and other installations like space stations. It was pretty much the standard shuttle, and we only know it as Class F, although some call it the Galileo type. Moving on, we have the Takayama type shuttle, also known as Shuttlecraft Warrant, from Star Trek Into Darkness. This seems to be the standard shuttlecraft on board the JJ Enterprise. Pretty much the classic lines, just sleeked up a bit with kind of slung back engines. Again, we don't know for sure if it was warp or not, but these engines sure look warpy to me. What do you think? It's about 12 meters long, although of course quite a bit of that will be your engine sticking out the back here. So actual usable space is going to be less. This is essentially a scaled up version, an updated, modernized version of the Kelvin Shuttle, which makes perfect sense in universe. It's about a 3-decade newer version, but it fits in nicely. And because we know the Kelvin Shuttle is technically canon, I decided to include this, even though it's clearly an alternative universe take. Who's to say something similar didn't exist in the Prime Kirk universe, even if we didn't see it? A lot of things existed in TOS that we didn't see because of technical limitations of the time, of course. So that's the first. One's there. So far, with the one error in the model being the exception, all of these are pretty neat to me. I especially like the new JJ ones just because I didn't have a clue what they look like. So it's pretty neat, and I think, yeah, I like them. They have more of an homage to the originals than some of the bigger ships from the JJ-verse. Well, let's move on. Moving on, we have the Type 15 Shuttlepod. So we've been into shuttlecraft for a while now. We're back to the concept of a shuttlepod. This was first seen in Season 2 of Next Generation. But we know, at least in universe, these are supposedly on board Galaxy-class ships like the Enterprise since it launched, and most likely used on other ships beforehand like the Nebula. This is a relatively tiny craft, about 3.6 meters tip to tip. It is not warp capable. The nacelles are distinctly for impulse. And if you look on the back, there's really nowhere else for an engine to be. So that makes sense. Crew 1 to 3 maximum. 2 can go in there pretty comfortably. 3 is pretty cramped. And we have a small cargo hold in the back. Now if we have 3 people, we can't use our cargo hold. So essentially that third person's cargo. This was a short-range light shuttle, so basically used to ferry people or components from ship to ship or ship to surface and back, not intended for interplanetary or deep space travel. In reality, the reason this was introduced to the show was so they had a smaller life-size model that actually looked okay on screen, one they could design with economy. And it's perfectly sensible to have multiple types, classes of ship on board. I say shuttles on board different ships. Not everything needs to be big. Tiny little thing, yeah, shuttle pod. Really kind of analogous to like Apollo space capsule. Not very big, but neat for all that. I was actually looking forward to this model. I like the little ones. You don't see much, even though it's kind of a little car in space. And this one really doesn't like to sit on its pillar because it's got a kind of a bump on the bottom of the model. A raised section where stuff is in the original would have been stored. So it's kind of uneven and it always falls off, see? Next up, we kind of have the ubiquitous next generation shuttle. This is the Type 6. This is returning to being a shuttlecraft. We're about 6 meters long, so not quite double the length of the Type 15. It has a typical crew of 2, and it can probably carry 4 passengers comfortably, maybe more in an emergency. It is warp capable. It can reach at least warp 2 and sustain that for several hours. Of course, it's also impulse capable and all that good stuff. We know from dialogue that weapons, phasers, are not standard but can be fitted, so it can be armed. This is still considered a short-range shuttlecraft, but since it has warp, it's still quite a bit longer than the Type 15 there. This first appeared in Season 5 of Next Generation, but thanks to the final episode of the series, we know that these were meant to be on board since the very beginning. This is essentially an update of the Galileo 5 from Star Trek 5, which is not in the Eagle Moss collection yet. I do hope they make that one next. It is a little bit shorter, and it has warp nacelles versus impulse nacelles, but the front, aside from having extra windows added, is the same, and of course the back hatch is the same. Pretty much not exactly kind of like the Galileo 7 over there. I wasn't super excited about this one because it's so ubiquitous, but then again it would be a conspicuous absence if it was not there. But I can't say that about this next one. This is the Type 7 shuttle. This was the original shuttle seen on screen for Next Generation, designed by Andrew Perbert for the series. And Eagle Moss has more or less gone with the original very curvy concept here. Relatively big shuttle, about 8 meters long. This would be considered more of a medium range shuttle. It's also capable of warp, at least warp 2. Also not armed typically. I don't have any evidence, but based on dimensions and everything, it would seem like it has a larger crew or cargo capacity than a Type 6. We know it has a standard, a crew, operating crew of at least 2, and then passengers, so. We saw this from Season 1 through 4 as standard, and then we saw it intermittently in Season 6 and 7, and then it actually made an appearance in Generations, which was kind of neat. So we know it was on board the Galaxy-class Enterprise for the duration of its existence. As is pretty well known, unfortunately when they tried to, they could make a miniature to show this flying in space, but when they tried to make a life-size mock-up for actors to interact with, they had a lot of hard time getting the curves and dimensions right. So there are some variations and some less than convincing representations of this ship. But yeah, this is the bigger brother to the Type 6, as seen on board the Enterprise. It was also used on other stations and whatnot, and I really like this model. This is one that you don't see too often. It was a big part of Next Generation, and it's just not one you saw. Everyone more or less made the Type 6 and ignored the Type 7 when they were making models. So cool. Plus this one's pretty big. The nice lines on it. Good weight. And it's more elegant than the Type 15 and Type 6. Well, those are what we have from Next Generation. Let's move on to Deep Space Nine. Got a smaller, longer one here. This is the Type 10. And the one Type 10 assigned to the Defiant was the Chaffee. Originally, the Defiant only had Type 18 pods, which were essentially the same as Type 15, just updated. The interior sets were actually the same, so externally they looked a little different, but as an update. In the real world, they had to make the Type 10 because the Type 18 miniature was stolen or lost or whatever. So they needed a new shuttle for the Defiant. In universe, they say that one of these was fitted to the Defiant. And there's only one on board. It's pretty long, at 8.5 meters, but it's pretty narrow and sleek. So it only really holds about 4 people. Possibly 6 in an emergency. What's neat about this, much like the Defiant herself, in addition to having Defiant-style warp nacelles, so we know this can go to warp, and by the way, having compact nacelles on board a shuttle like this that's on the Defiant makes total sense. Anyway, we also know this was armored. It had stronger hull and armoring than a standard shuttle. It also had phasers and micro-photon torpedoes as standard. It had an oversized computer core. And it had redundant systems. So much like the Defiant herself, this was designed potentially for being used in a combat or even attack situation. So it had extra everything. This has been referred to as a speedboat, and I can see why. It's got a very boat-like hull. Obviously, like any shuttle, it can land on a planet. And I think the little Defiant nacelles are cool. Gives it a unique look. This is, in universe, supposedly an evolution of the Type 6. And you can definitely see a little bit of the Type 7 in it as well. So that's kind of neat. But unfortunately, this only showed up in one episode of Deep Space. Yep, see? Hey, I'm surprised it went this long. This one's hard, too, to get on the stand, because the engines kind of sit at the top. And once it's on, it's okay. It doesn't like to slide off like the 15, but yeah. I think it's pretty neat. I like the model. It's slender. It's mostly plastic, as a lot of these are because they're shuttles, but yeah, it's probably one of my favorites from that first collection batch there. So there we have it. The Next Generation shuttles, and getting into the Defiant shuttle, which the Defiant, of course, was designed after the Battle of Wolf 359, well, before it and after it, technically, in that same kind of Next Generation era. And again, there was the Type 18, which we don't have yet. I do hope they make it as a shuttle pod. So essentially, yeah, the Defiant had a couple of shuttle pods and one true shuttlecraft capable of warp. And capable of some offense and defense, too. So it wasn't really used as a disposable shuttle either. Well, we'll move on. Alrighty, moving on. I want to make one correction. I thought I misspoke on the Type 10, the Chaffee. I think I might have said 8.5 meters. It's actually 6.5. which makes sense compared to the fact that it's supposed to be an upgrade of the Type 6, which is 6. The extra half meter would explain the slightly longer nose and how the engines hang over the back. Anyway, I just wanted to make that correction. I was, after I said it, kind of questioning myself, and then I went and looked real quick. So yeah, 6 meters, 6.5. See, there we go. Yeah, you try remembering all this stuff all at one go. Moving on, see if I can grab the right one. Moving on, we have the Type 9, or Class 2 shuttle, featured in Voyager, starting in Season 2. Now, Voyager is a TARDIS. There's no other explanation for how many shuttles and how many different types of shuttles we see on board that ship. Originally, it had Type 6s. It also had Type 8s, which were essentially Type 6s, but with Voyager-esque nacelles like you see, or hopefully see, here. So we'll call it a Type 6 with better nacelles, better warp, which makes sense because we know this ship has a max warp of 4, so about double that of the Type 6. We can assume the Type 8 was around the same speed. This is about 8.5 meters, but as you can tell, it's a pretty slender profile. They're getting into more sleek, and we also have this large cutout in the back with these, boy, this is going to be hard for me to show you, I apologize. Hollow area. So even though it is 8.5 meters, a couple of those meters are ate up by, I don't know, flaring, whatever this is. I mean, I'm sure it's part of the engine. So, usable space, and as you can tell, it's pretty thin. This can be operated by one person. Seems to have a maximum total capacity of about 4 people. It's designed to be fast and maneuverable, but not really for a long-range shuttle. This is relatively short range. I mean, it has pretty fast warp, so distance-wise it can go there, but a person probably wouldn't be terribly comfortable in this for too long. Phasers are now standard on Federation shuttlecraft, including the Type 9 here. So we had Type 6s, Type 8s, and Type 9s on Voyager. And then we get, of course, the Delta Flyer in Season 5. So, yeah, Voyager and shuttles is a topic for another video. It's a cool-looking shuttle, and I do like that it is pretty compact, which makes sense for a craft like the Intrepid, which is not terribly big. And since the Intrepid was kind of a dual science and combat ship, I could see this performing both roles. And we saw this being a very capable fighter for a shuttlecraft at least. So it has pretty reasonably strong phasers. I don't believe it has photon torpedoes, or micro photons I should say. I think it's just mostly phasers. But, yeah. As far as a model, it's neat. I really like it. It's one I had no idea what it looked like either, being later. A lot of these were CGI. In fact, there was a studio model for the space scenes, but they never built the full actor interactive model for Voyager because they were going to so much CGI. And we still saw these throughout the run of Voyager, even though the Delta Flyer became the primary shuttle. And of course, we also saw these in use by other Starfleet vessels and installations throughout Voyager, so it wasn't exclusive to an Intrepid class. But yeah, just a further evolution, kind of blending of the whole shuttlecraft shuttlepod thing. It's bigger than a shuttlepod, but it's not quite as big, at least internally, as a shuttlecraft, I would say. And of course, most of the time we saw those on Voyager, they were crashing or being attacked, so there's that. So, Yeah, the Type 9. Moving on, we have the Type 11 shuttle, as featured in Nemesis. This seems to be one of the standard shuttles on board the Sovereign class. And it's a big one. We had a lot of runabouts, of course, featured in Deep Space Nine, and we even saw one or two guest appearances of the runabout in Next Generation. But this is one of the first kind of shuttles that starts to get runabout size. It's about 16 meters long. A runabout's about 23, 24. So we're still smaller, but as you can tell, 16 meters is quite a bit bigger than previous Enterprise shuttles. Now the flip of it is we're pretty narrow. So we're long, we're not very tall, and obviously just one deck. As usual, typical crew, the pilot is 2, and it seems like it can comfortably hold 6 total people for extended duration, and probably many more in emergency. And this is more of a medium to long range shuttle. Again, it's verging on being a runabout. So, makes sense for the Sovereign. We know again that phasers are standard. Warp is standard. It seems like they might have learned their lesson with a bunch of kind of little disposable shuttles here. This one is much more substantial. And I like the model here. It's probably my favorite from this set. While it's not particularly thick, it's very long. And, yeah, just a neat, modern, Sovereign-esque shuttle. It's got some weight to it, too. This one's got a little more metal. The whole top part is metal. And finally, we're getting to the end. Come on. Let's take this one off. So I can put this one back on. And as promised, here is the Argo shuttle. Probably the biggest one we have here. This is 20 meters long. This is classified as a heavy transport or cargo freight shuttle. It is warp capable for sure. It's got kind of recessed warp engines. These wings can fold up when they're down like this. That's atmospheric mode, which makes sense because this is a cargo. It's probably carrying a lot of weight. Good to have some wings. For space flight, they fold up against the hull. This is the one that carried the big four-wheeler ATV in the back, as seen in Nemesis. Ostensibly it can carry other things as well, or at least the general type. We don't know for sure. This is usually just referred to as the Argo type, but it has been referred to in production material as a Type 17. So we can go with Type 17 if we want. Probably the Enterprise E only carries one of these, maybe two. It's a very specialized shuttle. Again, a cargo shuttle. And the particular Argo here had the dune buggy or the ATV or the four-wheeler. Yep. I know a lot of people have been kind of disappointed with this model. I think it must be visual because just holding it, I really like it. It's unique. It's a little kind of wonky for a Starfleet shuttle, but I think with enough minivans in space, it was kind of time to have something different. So, I like it. I'm glad they did it. And it's a reasonably big size, too. Not my favorite in the set, but I don't despise it. But then again, I don't have to look at it. I'm handling it. And like I said kind of at the beginning, what I think is neat is it does have a certain hearkening to the JJ. Oops, I think I picked the wrong one up. You should eat. Sorry, guys. Sometimes it's difficult. The military transport. I don't know. I see a certain similarity. So if this is an early 23rd century transport cargo, I don't know. The Argo being a 24th century kind of fits in. Speaking of minivans in space, before I go, of course, when we were kids and the minivan came out, that made for a great shuttlecraft stand-ins. Scarily so. Well, that's an overview of the shuttlecraft, at least most of them. There's 3 or 4 missing, which hopefully they will give us from Eagle Moss. Also, I didn't do things like the Work Bee or the shuttle, like the transport pod. I think I'll probably do those in a separate video, looking at more like utility type craft. Not a lot to say on the history, like where these were built in numbers, because most of the time we don't know. They're just shuttles, or they were, their specs were changed to fit the plot of the episode, so you have to be a little bit understanding. Kind of like with the Type 9 being referred to as a Class 2 shuttle. I like to think of Class 1s as being the shuttle pods and Class 2s being the shuttlecraft, which would make sense. Designate your larger warp capables as a one class and your smaller impulse only as another class. Just kind of a way to justify it. It's not exactly a thing. Plus we have the Class F, the Galileo from the original series. So using class whatever isn't exactly out of the ordinary, completely unusual. Most of these I like. They are overpriced for what they are, but I waited till I could get them on sale and knock the price down. These come in sets of 4. Typically they're $100 for all 4, which is crazy. I waited till I could knock the price down and use different coupons and limited offers and got the price down to just about $60. So still kind of crazy, but I can justify $15 each. A lot better than $25, and of course that's with free shipping, and you get the magazine, and you get a little holographic display thing for them too. Okay, the truth is I was just bored and might have had a few drinks one weekend and ordered them. I actually ordered the first 2 together, then the 3rd and the 4th separately as they came out. So that I would share, since we not really talked about shuttles. And like I said at the beginning, it didn't really seem a good idea to do individual videos on each of these, and other people have done looking at each 4-pack set, so I thought I would do more of a historical look. Again, I did my best with the camera work. Sorry. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Any questions or comments, please post them below as always. And as always, this is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.